Vanchakalpatarubhyascha kripasindhubhyev cha patitanam pavanebhyo vaishnavebhyo namo namaha. Om Jnanatimirandasya Gyananjana Shalakaya Chakshurunmilitam Yena Tasmai Shri Gurave Namaha. Jai Shriman Narayana, Jai Shriman Narayana, Jai Shriman Narayana. Very good. Very good. So Srimad Bhagavatam. Srimad Bhagavatam is one of the most important Vedic scriptures. It's not one of the most well-known of the Vedic scriptures. When we think about the Vedic scriptures, of course, we tend to think of the four Vedas themselves. We tend to think of Bhagavad Gita. We tend to think of the Upanishads. But then we also know that there are many genres of literature. This is one of the richnesses of Vedic culture, is that there are many genres and it goes very, very deep. The truth of the matter is, the very gist of Vedantic philosophy can be understood very, very easily. Sarva dharman parityajya mam ekam sharanam vraja aham tvam sarva pabebhyoho mokshayishyami ma shuchaha. In this one verse is actually contained the most important teaching of the entire Vedic literature, where Krishna in Bhagavad Gita says, "Abandon all varieties of artificial man-made religion and simply surrender unto me. I will deliver you from all negative reactions. Do not fear." The truth of the matter is, if we want to understand the very core essence of all spirituality, that one verse contains it. But at the same time, for those of us who have a little bit of intellectual and spiritual curiosity, and we want to go in depth, more in depth, infinitely in depth, this is why there are so many Vedic scriptures. So the truth of the matter is, if we wanted to read the full genre, the full corpus, the full body of Vedic works, it could take us much of our life until we get to the very end. But one of these genres specifically is known as the Puranic literature, the Puranas. There are 36 Puranas in total, 18 minor Puranas and 18 major Puranas. And of the 18 major Puranas, the most important of all of them, bar none, is Bhagavata Purana, what is also called Srimad Bhagavatam. Now, why is this Purana so important? Why is it the chief among them? Several reasons. First of all, the Puranas themselves, the 18 major ones, are naturally divided, according to the Padma Purana itself, into 3 divisions of 6 Puranas each. And these divisions are in accordance with the gunas. So 6 of these Puranas are considered to actually be tamasic, 6 are considered to be rajasic, and only 6 are considered to be sattvic. Sattvic meaning of the highest spiritual quality. Of those 6, the most important is indeed the Srimad Bhagavatam, the scripture that we will be discussing today. But still this begs the question, why? Why is the Srimad Bhagavatam the most important of all the Puranas? The reason why, very simply, is contained in the very name itself. Srimad Bhagavatam, or Bhagavata Purana. Bhagavata refers to the highest, to God. When we read the Srimad Bhagavatam, as opposed to any other Purana, what we see is that, unlike the other Puranas, this Purana focuses exclusively on knowing God and in the philosophy, the worldview, the practices that are necessary for knowing God. And when we say knowing God, we mean knowing God in the most direct and most unadulterated way imaginable. In other words, you do not approach this scripture, the Srimad Bhagavatam, unless you have relinquished ego. You do not approach the scripture until it comes to the point where you're not interested in that being who is second best in comparison to God, 10th best, 100th best. In other words, when you have come to the point where you're no longer interested in gods and goddesses, You're no longer interested in spirit beings. You're no longer interested in any other metaphysical phenomena other than, quite literally, the highest. That which is termed, that which is designated Brahman. That which is the source of all reality, Janmadhyasya Yataha, as it says in Brahma Sutras. That which is the source of all things. Until it comes to the point where you are interested in that and only that. And even then, let's qualify this even more, interested. Even interest is not enough. If it's merely an intellectual interest. When it comes to the point, truthfully speaking, when you have left even interest behind, mere intellectual interest and self-interest, selfishness, ego, when you are ready to relinquish all and you wish to know that highest, then you approach Srimad Bhagavatam. So this is what makes this the Purana par excellence, the most important of all Puranas. And for those who have not read Srimad Bhagavatam, please get a copy. There are several translations in English. Prabhupada, of course, has one translation, which I consider the best. There are several others that are available. You can just look them up on your own. I am not translating the entire Srimad Bhagavatam. I'll be translating several hundred verses for the purpose of this class. But again, I won't be translating the entire Srimad Bhagavatam. I have other translation projects that make that impossible. Read the Srimad Bhagavatam when you have a chance, and you will see yourself why this is such an important scripture. Now, all that being said, let's begin with first canto of 12 cantos, first canto, first chapter, first verse of the Srimad Bhagavatam. And I believe everyone has a copy of this. This is my translation, which I feel is a very good translation. I tried my best to, on the one hand, be very faithful to the literal meaning of the verse in the Sanskrit, while at the same time trying to convey philosophically what is being said. With other verses, in addition, I'll also be trying to communicate the actual mood of the verses as well. But that was a little bit less important with this particular verse because of its highly philosophical nature. So, first it begins. Om Namo Bhagavate Vasudevaya. This in itself is a very, very important mantra. So much so that before we actually delve further into the verse, I would like us all to repeat this, please, together, 3 times. And you heard how I said it, so everyone together. Om Namo Bhagavate Vasudevaya. Om Namo Bhagavate Vasudevaya. Om Namo Bhagavate Vasudevaya. Very good. And we will begin with this and then go on to the rest of the verse. The translation of this mantra is, I offer my obeisances to that absolute Lord who dwells within all beings. So, Vasudeva. Vasudeva is one of the names of Narayana. It's also specifically one of the names of Krishna. And what Vasudeva means is the son of Vasudeva. Vasudeva. Vasudeva was the father of Krishna when Krishna appeared upon the earth approximately 5,200 years ago. But in addition, it also means that being who is indwelling, that being who is indwelling in all things. Now, what precisely is meant by this? Well, we know that God is omnipresent, of course. We know that there is no place where God is not. In fact, if there were anything, either material or spiritual, in which God's presence were absent, that thing would not exist. That something would be a nothing, by definition. It is God's indwelling presence in us, in every atom of our body, in every atom of even inanimate object. It is God's presence in everything that gives that thing its substantial being, that gives that thing its purpose, first of all, and second, its ability to exist. So this is the nature of God, and it's specifically with this name of Vasudeva that we see this. Thus, when we think about the fact that God is also Narayana, this is another name for God. And what does Narayana mean? Anyone? Sustainer. Very good. Sustainer. Sustainer. See, it's very interesting. At some point in the future, maybe we'll do this actually. At some point in the future, we will do this. We will go through the Sri Vishnu Sahasranama, another important scripture that is the 1,000 names of Vishnu, the 1,000 names of Narayana, the 1,000 names of God. And it's fascinating how each one of these Sanskrit names for God has a meaning like this. They have a very, very important meaning where they reveal various aspects of the divine. But in this particular case, again, God as indweller, as indwelling all things, and thus Narayana, sustaining everything in existence. All right? So what this mantra, of course, is saying is somewhat self-explanatory, that we are offering our obeisances, thus namaha, namo. We are offering our obeisances, our respects, etc., with devotion, because it is understood by implication that the term namaha means not merely offering respects, but with the bhakti element. And our respects to who? Om, that absolute, who is Bhagavan, who is the Lord, and in this particular case, with this specific name, Vasudeva, who is the indweller of all beings. Now let's go on a little bit. And I'm going to very quickly just read the rest of this verse, and then we'll go through it little by little. All right. I meditate upon that Absolute, who is the source, the sustainer, and the final dissolution of all universes. He has full cognizance, that is both directly and indirectly aware of all things, and is fully independent, svarat, independent. It is that Absolute who first imparted knowledge of himself, that is, of Brahman, of himself, about whom even the gods are bewildered, as if mistaken by the illusion of earth seen on water, or water seen upon the earth. And he imparted this knowledge directly to the heart of Brahma, the first created being within our material universe. It is due to him alone that the three gunas, that is the modes of materiality, sattva, rajas, tamas, seem real, although illusory. He is always transcendentally situated and is always free from illusion. Dhimahi. Satyam param dhimahi. I meditate upon that absolute truth. Very good. So that's the full verse. As you can see, even just with one read-through of this verse, highly philosophical, very important, but actually much more so than we even know. A little bit more background is necessary in order to now philosophically explicate this verse. And that is this. Again, the Srimad Bhagavatam, very important Vedic scripture, the most important of all the Puranas specifically, because it talks about God, but also more from a literary perspective. The Srimad Bhagavatam has a purpose to it, in addition to revealing what is the nature of God, and that is, it serves as an actual commentary on the Brahma Sutras. For those people who know, the Brahma Sutras is the main scripture of Vedanta, written by Vedavyasa, Vyasadeva. He is the author of the Brahma Sutras. Well, Vyasa is also the author of the Srimad Bhagavatam. And within the pages of the Srimad Bhagavatam itself, it's explained that being dissatisfied with the fact that he wrote the Brahma Sutras, but without then going deeper and explaining the Brahma Sutras, he decided to write a freestyle commentary upon the Brahma Sutras. That is the Srimad Bhagavatam. It is his commentary, the author's commentary on his own book, the Brahma Sutras. So with that understanding, This is why, if you look at the Sanskrit, this verse begins with a sutra from the Brahma Sutras. Jamadyasya yataha, Janmadyasya yataha is itself an independent verse. It's the second verse of the Brahma Sutras. And what it means is that Brahman, or God, is that being from whom proceeds everything. So it's interesting how this verse begins with a smaller verse from the Brahma Sutras to thus show that, yes, this entire work now is going to be a commentary on the Brahma Sutras. In addition to this, to show even more the sacred nature and the Vedic nature of this work, it begins with elements of the Brahma Gayatri mantra, Dhimahi. As we can see, Satyam Param Dhimahi. Dhimahi, I meditate upon, is one of the primary, in fact, one could say the primary element of all Gayatri mantras. If there's any Gayatri mantra, not just the primary Brahma Gayatri, but all of the Gayatri mantras have this important element within them, Dhimahi. Thus, he begins by establishing the authority of this book, by showing that it is a commentary upon the Brahma Sutras, the most important philosophical work on earth. And he also shows the sacred nature and the Vedic nature of the Srimad Bhagavatam by ending this verse with an element from Gayatri Mantra. All right? So this is one of those things which, if you don't know that, you don't know it. It has to be told to you, it has to be revealed. Now, all that being said, finally, now let's go into this verse and try to understand what it is telling us. So, I meditate upon that Absolute who is the source, the sustainer, and the final dissolution of all universes. Very good. Very powerful way, very philosophical way, very cosmogonic way and cosmological way to begin this verse, where he is explaining first that not merely stating a theological, philosophical, ontological statement about the nature of the Absolute, but also stating the devotional and yogic element, i.e., I meditate upon. Not simply stating God is such and such, but I meditate upon that Absolute who is. All right, now let's go into this. Who is the source, the sustainer, and the final dissolution of all universes. Let's start with those last two words, because for people who are not very familiar with the Vedic worldview, that might sound a little bit confusing. Well, wait a minute, how many universes are there?
Infinite.
Was it?
Infinite.
Very good. I didn't even have to ask. Yes. Yes. How many universes are there? Interestingly, an infinite number of universes. So it is certainly correct to say that Vedic cosmology believes in the concept of multiple universes, and in fact, that's putting it very lightly. There is no number that you can put upon how many universes there actually are, material universes within the material realm. So this is very important. That first, it is stated that God's relationship is not merely with our universe, but all universes. And even quantitatively, to think of how stunning that is, that God as the source, the sustainer, and the final resting place of only our universe alone is mind-boggling. But then to think that there are infinite universes, Dharma Raja, isn't that amazing to think?
It's come out in the last few decades in physics too.
Mm-hmm. Yes, it has. Yes. And this Absolute, who we wish to know, who we worship with devotion, upon whom we meditate each day, is the source of every single one of them. It's astonishing. It's amazing. But now, going back to the rest of this sentence. So, God is both the source. That's of course self-explanatory. That's understood. That God is the origin, that God is the source of all things, known and unknown, material and spiritual. But more, God is also the sustainer of all things. Again, the highest name for God in the Vedic scriptures, according to the scriptures, according to the Srimad Bhagavatam itself, according to Narayana Upanishad, according to such authorities as the Alvars, Srinatha Muni, Ramanuja, so many people, the highest name for God is Narayana, and specifically Sriman Narayana. And Narayana itself is translated as the sustainer of everything, the sustainer of all beings. And we talked about this a little bit just a short time ago, so I won't go very in depth. It is indeed God's presence within all beings that sustains, that gives raison d'être, that gives being itself a purpose to all things. So God is creator, God is sustainer. But then finally, God is also the final dissolution of all things. So God is everything. God is the final resting place of all material things. All universes come to an end. When this particular universe, like all the other universes, finally comes to an end, they find their ultimate repose back in their source, back in God. Thus God is indeed beginning, middle, and end of all things. Now, let's go on a little bit more to the next sentence. So that absolute Brahman, Vasudeva, Narayana, God, he has full cognizance. That is, he is both directly and indirectly aware of all things. Let's stop there for now. Let's stop there for now. This is what is sometimes known as omniscience, sarvagya in Sanskrit, which means omniscience. That is, God knows all. There is nothing that God does not know. And this is very easy to understand if you understand that God is the source of all things. There is nothing that exists independently from God. Absolutely nothing that exists independently from God. Thus, he has all knowledge. It's interesting when once in a while you'll watch a film or you'll watch a TV show or something where something occurs, but then for one reason or another, the director will decide to show it to you again, but from a different angle, maybe several different angles. And you see different perspectives of that one same action that occurred. We've all seen this in various movies, TV shows, etc. Well, envision that for every occurrence in existence, there are quite literally an infinite number of perspectives through which that occurrence can be experienced, and God experiences them all now, simultaneously. That's omniscience. That is full cognizance. Again, it's inconceivable to us, but this is how God experiences all things, and he's confused by none of it. See, we'd be overwhelmed just having a dozen perspectives of one particular thing at once. We would be overwhelmed. And for God, it's infinitely so, but he's never overwhelmed. And he is fully independent. So all things are dependent upon God, but according to this, God is fully independent. Now, why is this important? This is important because, and I won't go very in-depth into this because we can go very in-depth into this, has to do with causality, it has to do with dependency, it has to do with many philosophical concepts. The idea is that everything that we see around us is dependent upon other things. Everything exists within a spectrum of causality. There is nothing that occurs, there is nothing that is not caused by something else, and which very often in itself is the cause of further effects. Thus, everything is dependent. We ourselves, as much as a result of our ego, we try to convince ourselves that we're independent. We, above all, are dependent. Try to stop eating. We're dependent. We're dependent on many things. God, however, is that being who transcends causality. God is that being and that sole being who is dependent upon nothing, being the source of all things. Now let's go on a little bit more. Now this next sentence is a little bit long and a little bit bulky, and there was no other way to translate this in order to capture precisely what it was trying to say philosophically. So we'll take our time with this next sentence, which again is a little bit bulky, but that's all right. It is that absolute who first imparted knowledge of himself. Let's stop there. Let's stop there. This may seem to not have said very much, but this one little clause of one sentence, of one verse, we could actually talk about for the rest of the day. And I'm talking about it until past the sun, after the sun goes down. I promise you we won't, but I'm just explaining. This little clause itself is very, very important. So it is that absolute who first imparted knowledge of himself. What this is pointing to is derivation of authority and derivation of knowledge. In other words, this is an epistemological clause of an important sentence. That is, it's explaining what is the source of true knowledge. What should be the source of true knowledge? If knowledge in its purest essence, and it's implied, it's obvious that we're talking about knowledge in its purest essence, since we're talking about something that has occurred at the very beginning of time, something that is involving God himself. We're not talking about, well, God had some opinion and he decided to share it with someone. No, we're talking about truth itself. Sui generis, truth itself we're talking about. All right? How is that truth conveyed? Well, truth about the highest must have its origin, its source in the highest. It being ontologically something that is the rarest of things and something whose very being itself is something that does not lend itself to the lower, to a second, to a third. Necessarily its source must be that primary source. In other words, God himself. In other words, to state this very simply, truth in its purest essence must be non-distinct from God and conveyed first by God. All right? So that's what this is saying. Now let's go on a little bit deeper. So it is that absolute who first imparted knowledge of himself. Now, this clause is important because it's still talking about this form of knowledge. About whom even the gods are bewildered. This is another clause supporting what we just said. That is, that this knowledge, absolute truth, is something that in fact is so high that, imagine this, even higher beings, even the gods, even many sages, the term is sura, the term that's used here, sura, as opposed to asura. Sura is the word that's used. A sura is a being who is very good, who is very lofty, who is very elevated, who is very noble. Even these beings, in sometimes attempting to know truth, are bewildered. Okay? Thus, that is why the first clause, such knowledge must be imparted primarily by God. Because even if the gods speculate, even if higher beings try to speculate, oh, what is truth? They'll be confused. Think about that. What to speak of humans, what to speak of us. Thus, knowledge primarily must be given by God. All right, let's go a little deeper. So that knowledge about whom even the gods are bewildered, and now explains how they're bewildered. As if mistaken by the illusion of earth seen on water or water seen upon the earth. This is the nature of illusion. We're talking now about Maya. We're now talking about the psychological process that occurs within the beings such that due to their militating against truth, they necessarily place themselves in illusion and bewilderment. And this is the nature of illusion, that you mistake one thing for another. You mistake one thing for another. Let's look at the example that he gives, because these are very practical examples here. So he's giving these as examples. It's illusion as if, for example, earth seen on water. Anyone who's ever been on a boat, I mean a boat in serious waters like the Atlantic Ocean, the Pacific Ocean, or something like this, where you know that there is no land for hundreds of miles perhaps. Sometimes, as a sailor, as a person on a boat, you'll kind of just stare out at the seemingly infinite ocean. And due to many things, shadows, the sun just kind of shining in a certain way, the fact that you're a little bit tired that day, you'll look and you'll think that you see an island. This happens to people all the time, people who are serious boaters, people who seriously are sailors, etc. You'll stare out into the ocean and you'll think you see an island. It's an illusion. It's an illusion. There's actually nothing there. But for a little while, for you, it seems real. So much so that for a part of you psychologically, it is real, and your reaction to it is as if it is real. Let's look at the second example. Or water seen upon the earth. Of course, we have depictions of this all the time. People who are lost in deserts, for example, they haven't had anything to drink. They've had no water for days and days and days, and they begin to hallucinate. And they begin to, again, look out onto the hot, arid desert, and they start to think, oh, that looks like water over there. Isn't that a waterfall? And they'll actually go toward it and just get even more lost. But why will they go toward it and get even more lost? Why? Because even though it has no basis in reality, psychologically, for them, perceptually, phenomenologically, for that individual, right then, right there, it is real. For them. But it's not real in actuality. Subjectively, they think it's real. Objectively, it is not. Such is the nature of illusion. Thus, this is not in this verse, but we have this other very famous example of the person who is walking along the road and they see a rope, and of course they think it's a snake. And they jump back in fear until, however long, a few seconds later, a minute later, they look a little closer and they realize, oh, it's just a rope. Now, this is the thing. It was a rope when they approached it. It was a rope when they were scared of it. It was a rope after they realized what it was. For anyone else who was in that location previous to them, they knew it was a rope. But for that person, it was a snake. For that short period of time. For them, it was a snake. Even though it was a rope. So subjectively, it was a snake, even though objectively, it was a rope. Such is the nature of Maya. This is Maya. This is illusion. Where something is not the case, but for you, you think it is. And more importantly, you act accordingly. You think X thing will make me happy, even though it's an illusion, and you act accordingly. Let me grab X thing and use it. And for some reason, you're not happy because it was an illusion. So this is the sort of bewilderment that is experienced even by the gods when they themselves try to understand truth, which itself primarily is imparted by God. This is where we are so far in this. All right. So, Brahman, God, first imparted knowledge about himself directly to the heart of Brahma, the first created being. The first created being. We know that of all these multiple universes, of which there are an infinite number, and interestingly, an infinite variety. Why have an infinite number if you're not also going to have variety? God is very economical in how he does things. He's not going to have an infinite number without an infinite variety. Otherwise, that would be just redundant, and God is not redundant. If anything, God is the opposite of redundant. So, with each one of these universes, there is a first being who is born in that universe, and that is Brahma. Each universe has a Brahma, and that Brahma, in fact, will have a differing number of heads in accordance with how big the universe is. This is the first being. Knowledge is given to that first being so that then that being can create the universe. So interestingly, the direct creator of any given universe is not God. It is a limited being, a God, not God, but a God, known as Brahma. And in fact, Plato talked about this, Plotinus talked about this. You find this in Greco-Roman philosophical literature. This is called in the West the demiurge. Gnostics spoke about this. This is a concept that you find in many, many of the more advanced, philosophically advanced cultures of the world. That is the idea that God, being transcendent to materiality, necessarily does not manipulate materiality, but rather has a being to whom he imparts knowledge, and then that being creates. So this is Brahma. This is the first being who we're talking about. Now, that said, let's go on a little bit more. It is due to him, that is the absolute God, that the three gunas, modes of materiality, seem real, although illusory. So again, we're not going to go very in-depth into these three modes because I think most of my students understand the three gunas very well. But still, just for the sake of commenting upon this verse, I'll just talk about this a little bit. It is due to him that the three modes of materiality seem real. So he is the source of all things. He is the source of materiality itself, what is known as Prakriti in Sanskrit. Prakriti, or materiality itself, not simply the material, but materiality as a force, as an energy itself, is one of the energies of God. And it's not even considered one of the most important ones, but it's one of the energies of God. That material energy itself, materiality itself, within itself exists in three different modes: sattva, rajas, tamas. In other words, anything that's material, anything that we see around us that is inanimate, okay, including this. All right, let me say that again for those people who don't get it and are puzzled. Anything that is inanimate, including this. This is inanimate, correct? What am I pointing to?
Your body.
The body is inanimate. Okay? So everything that is inanimate, see, the being within is animate. The Atman, the soul within, the spirit within is animate. This, inanimate. More, mind substance, chitta, mind substance, inanimate. Intellect, inanimate. Emotions, inanimate. Ahankar, ego, inanimate, etc. Only Atman is animate. Only consciousness is animate. So anything that is inanimate exists in these three modes of nature. Sattva, that is goodness, positivity, light, health, etc. All sorts of wonderful things. Rajas, which is energy, passion, etc. Or tamas, which is enervation, which is dullness, ignorance, stillness, etc. Everything that is inanimate has these three things within them, and one or another will predominate at any given time. All right? And as human beings, that is, as animate units of consciousness presently inhabiting an inanimate form as body, we have the ability to cultivate one or another of these gunas. In other words, we can choose, and we should choose as yogis, to always be within the frequency of the highest guna, that is sattva. Okay? So that's what's being spoken of here, and it's being explained that it is due to God alone that materiality itself, along with its three gunas, seem real to us, even though they are indeed illusory. All right, let's go on a little bit more. He is always transcendentally situated and is always free from illusion. Now, verses like this are always of extreme importance, especially to me, because they are supremely Vedantic in nature. This little sentence right here, is extremely crucial because of its Vedantic nature, and because it resolves so many issues, philosophical issues, conundrums that are there within Vedanta itself. And it also gives the very gist of what is Vedanta and what is the ontological nature of God himself. All that in this little sentence. All that in this little sentence. So let me read this again and explain why this is the case. He, that is the absolute God, is always transcendentally situated and always free from illusion. Now, why is this important? Several reasons. First of all, it explains to some degree what is the nature of God, that God is a being who necessarily is unaffected by anything lesser than God, anything that is below God, and specifically materiality. It explains that God is of the nature of consciousness, thus God is Brahman, being transcendentally situated. That which is transcendental to materiality necessarily is consciousness, thus God is consciousness. But more than this, these two sections of this together, God is always transcendentally situated and is always free from illusion. Thus, what is this verse saying as far as the nature of God vis-a-vis materiality? And specifically, illusory materiality. That God never falls under illusion. And as my students know, we've looked at many verses from the scriptures that say this exact same thing, including when we were in Austin for our conference there. God does not fall into illusion. The scriptures are are unequivocal about this. God does not fall into illusion. God does not fall into illusion. God does not fall into illusion, period. Again, there are so many verses that state this emphatically that there is no question that this is the case. Now, why is this so important? For some, intuitively, we would think, well, why is he going on about this? Of course God doesn't fall into illusion. However, the Advaita school says he does. Of necessity, God must fall into illusion. And this is the conundrum that, again, in 1700 years roughly, starting with a little bit before Gaudapada, going through Shankaracharya, and so many other Advaitins up until this very day, Advaitin gurus who I myself have spoken with, who I had tremendous respect for, but who they themselves I very easily defeated in philosophical debate because they have no answer for this. If we are God, literally, if we are Brahman, but presently we are in illusion because we have forgotten this fact that we are God, and our goal is to remember that we are God and thus arise from our illusion, how did we as God fall under illusion? And by claiming that God as a transcendent being is subject to illusion, what we are claiming is that God is bound by illusion. Thus, there is something stronger than God. Illusion is stronger than God. Thus, God is not God, illusion is God. Necessarily, that which is the highest is God. So God is one step below illusion, according to Advaita. One step. Why? Because obviously illusion has the ability to overcome God. Thus, God is inferior to illusion. Well, this verse explains in an unadulterated, direct manner, God does not fall under illusion. Period. So, by extension, we are in illusion. We will sometimes try to lie to ourselves. Actually, not sometimes. We often, usually, most of the time, are lying to ourselves when we don't ourselves believe we're in illusion. See, everyone else is, but I'm not. That's what we tell ourselves. Either overtly or not overtly, either directly or indirectly, either subtly, not so subtly. We are convinced very often that, oh, I'm the only person not in illusion. Everyone else is a fool. That's ego. So the truth of the matter is we know we are in illusion. The very fact that we think we are not when we are shows that we are. Thus, we are not God. Because God is always free from illusion. According to this very important verse from the Vedic scriptures, but again, many verses that we have looked at, from the Upanishads, from the Puranas, from the Vedas themselves, etc. And then finally, Satyam param dhimahi. Satyam param dhimahi. I meditate upon that absolute truth. Ending in this way, just to reiterate the importance of not merely knowing what is the nature of God, what is the nature of God vis-a-vis we ourselves as living beings, i.e. that we are bewildered, not merely what is the nature of God vis-a-vis materiality, that is that God is the source of all materiality, and on and on and on, not merely understanding what is the nature of God in the philosophical, intellectual, scholastic sort of way, but more. This verse begins and it ends with, I meditate upon that. In other words, sadhana and devotion. It's not merely enough to know that this is the greatness of this being who is our source, but more, my relationship to that being is one of meditating upon that being in humility and with devotion. So, very important. So this is a very interesting construct, this verse. And let me tell you, let me be honest with you, it was not easy translating this verse with complete accuracy, the way I did. It was not easy, and I've done a lot of translating. I translated the entire Narada Bhakti Sutras. That was easy. That was easy. I've translated many, many things. But this was difficult because of the fact that it is indeed a verse that is pregnant with so many concepts within. It was kind of like the proverbial onion, a concept within a concept within a concept, all of which, however, form a self-sufficient unit, as does the Gayatri mantra, as does a sutra. Thus, this is why also it's very interesting that within this mantra you have sutra, and within the mantra you have Gayatri. Thus also to show the self-contained nature of this very verse itself. So I think people are understanding just how significant this verse is. This is one of maybe the most significant verse. It's one of the most significant, maybe the most significant verses in the entire Srimad Bhagavatam that we just covered. So with that, I could be wrong, but I believe I probably threw a lot at people with this verse. I didn't, the verse itself did. So with that, why don't I stop there and see if there are any questions about anything covering this verse or anything related to it. I'll give people a few moments to recover first. Yes, please.
Yes, I'm wondering about the relation of Brahma with Brahman. Now, can we picture Brahma as shaping the Prakriti that has already been created by Brahman? Brahma, as a mere god, doesn't have the ability to create something out of nothing.
Correct. Absolutely correct.
So he is just imparting a shape and attributes to matter, that the fundamental material that already was manifested by Brahman.
Absolutely, yes, you're correct. You're correct about that. Yeah, Prakriti itself is eternal. Prakriti, materiality, prime materiality itself is an eternal energy, an eternal element that is one of the Shaktis, one of the powers of God. It exists originally in an equipoised state, and what disturbs that equipoised state is the introduction of consciousness within it. In other words, when Atmans fall into illusion and thus necessarily go from the realm of pure transcendence to then materiality, that disturbs the equipoised nature of materiality. It begins to move. At this point is when the gunas, as the first primary building blocks of materiality, begin to form. So now you can see the gunas. They were there previously. They pre-exist, but now you can detect them, and now they have individuation and distinction among them. At this point, Brahma, long last day, Brahma, the demiurge, this God who is a finite being, is given the ability to take that prime materiality that now is in a state of no longer being equipoised and use that as the building blocks of a material universe. And even how Brahma creates initially is very interesting. He does this through sound vibration. He creates through sound vibration, and then he creates bodies for beings who can then, of course, create other beings. So then you have, the succession of generations of living beings. But still, Brahma only deals with materiality, so with their bodies, and again with the original models of any particular species. Does that answer your question?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Very good. Oh, I'm sorry, just one more thing I have to say. Yeah, it's always very frustratingly confusing for people that there are so many words that seem similar and they actually have little to do with one another, other than the fact that they, in either direct or indirect way, have to do with God, and that is these words, Brahman, Brahma, Brahmana. Okay? These words sound so similar, yet they mean three distinct things. Brahman is God, but in the philosophical sense of God as the absolute, that which is ever expanding. That is Brahman, God. Then there's Brahma. Brahma is a specific person, and that's his name, is Brahma. He is a finite being like any one of us, and that is the demiurge, the first creator within any universe. Then there is Brahmana. A Brahmana is a human being who is a priest. But more than that, a Brahmana is a person who wishes to know Brahman, who wishes to know God. So it's a person who attempts to live a purely sattvic lifestyle. So just to clarify that, especially for people who will be watching the video later. The vast, vast, vast majority of individual beings who exist within any particular universe have their source, as far as their bodies, either directly or indirectly from Brahma, from that creator. Of course, Brahma only creates the bodies. The Atman itself, the consciousness, of course, has God as the source of that. So that would be Narayana, who is the source of the Atman. Brahma is the source only of the bodies. Again, he only manipulates matter. And that's why I did that, This is inanimate. The body is inanimate. So Brahma, you could say, ultimately is responsible for creating the bodies. And not that he created this specific body. See, that's the thing. He got the ball rolling. He created the first devas, the first gods, who would then be the first progenitors of human beings, and specifically Manu. So ultimately, you could say Brahma is responsible even for all of our bodies. Of course, our parents are responsible for our body, but you trace that back far enough, and the first bodies were created by Brahma. So certainly that's true. However, there are a tiny number of cases, so tiny that it's infinitesimal, of beings who enter this world directly as a result of God's will, and have nothing to do with Brahma. Possibly they have been even Brahmas in their life, but it doesn't matter. See, this is the nature of the free will and free nature, the independent nature, Svarat, as is said in this verse, the independent nature of God. That even though, yes, things are in motion within a particular material universe, and the physics is working, and everything is being upheld, and generation after generation is occurring, and causality and time and space, etc., still, God can choose to do something despite, in addition to all that. So once in a while, beings will enter this universe who do not have Brahma as their intermediary. In fact, what's the primary example of that? Avatars. When the avatars come, Brahma has no say in that. And their bodies are not even material. Their bodies are not material. Their quote unquote, their svarupa, their form is actually spiritual in nature. But it's not just the direct avatars. It's also some avesha avatars. It's also some other beings who come to this world either because of God's will or sometimes even their own will. And Brahma cannot really even be seen as their source at all. But that's rare. Any other questions, please?
Is the Atman the only aggregate, or actually source, that's dependent on its origination comes from Narayana or Brahman, and all the other aggregates below that are dependent on Brahma? Is that?
The formation of material aggregates is dependent upon Brahma. You see, so that's why I was making that distinction. Prime materiality itself, of course, is sourced in God. God is the source of prime materiality itself. But then, how do you take this thing, this energy, materiality as energy, and then give it form? That's what Brahma does. Does that answer your question? Yeah. Yes?
So we know from scripture that Brahma creates, but then those philosophers that figured that out or made the right assumption that the demiurge creates rather than God, did they have access to the scripture, or did they just figure that out because they said God was transcendent to materiality, and is that how they figured that out?
Oh, that's a good question. That's a very good question. They didn't figure it out. These were sages. Yeah. See, I'll give you just the most well-known example. A person in the Western world, for example, one of the first people who we have in writing who spoke about the concept of the demiurge was Plato. Of course, most academicians and our culture for the last several hundred years being an intellectually oriented culture, we tend to think of Plato as really smart guy. We call him a quote-unquote philosopher, and in our estimation, that means, well, he must have been kind of like a professor in the Greek world. No, Plato was a sage. Plato was a sage, as was Socrates, as was Plotinus, as were so many of these individuals in the ancient world who we today call quote-unquote philosophers. And again, we tend to think of a philosopher as some sort of professor, with a tweed jacket, kind of sitting around speculating, smoking on his pipe. It's not what philosopher meant 2,000, 2,500, 3,000 years ago. A philosopher necessarily was an individual who certainly had wisdom, but at the same time was akin to what we today would call a yogi. So these are individuals who had realization in addition to having wisdom. These are individuals who, Plato himself talks about this, about having direct insight into the nature of reality. It's not enough merely to, in other words, think your way to truth, but you have to directly experience that truth. Plato talks about this in the Symposium, in Phaedrus, I believe, several of his dialogues. So these individuals were mystics. Plato was a mystic. Yes, he was a philosopher, but in the true sense of that term. You see, a philosopher necessarily, in the true sense of that term, is a mystic. Verus philosophus est amator Dei, said St. Augustine in The City of God. The true philosopher is the lover of God. That's what Augustine said. And it's true. Does that answer your question?
Yes, thank you.
Yeah. Very good. All right. Maybe one more question, please.
So obviously Brahman does not necessarily need Brahma, correct?
Yes, that's correct.
Why then does Brahma exist?
Oh, that's a good question. That's a good question, actually. There is a reason why, let's say, this system of creation is set up the way it is. And it's a little bit complex, but I'll try to answer this briefly as I can, while doing justice to the question. The reason why there have to be Brahmas is because, well, the way to answer that is to ask another question. Why do there have to be material universes to begin with? Why do there have to be formed material universes? Why is it that prime materiality has to become what we see around us, this diversity of nama and rupa, of name and form that we see around us? The reason why is because there are Atmans who, being first in their original state of purity that is within the spiritual realm, there are Atmans who choose to come here. There are Atmans who choose to be in a realm where they can explore in an artificial sort of way, in an illusory sort of way. Thus, as a result of that desire, there is the necessity for there being material universes. Okay? That's number one. Now, understanding that, how does an Atman come into the universe? An individual Atman, let's say, before it falls into the universe, when it is itself in a neutral position where it neither is egotistical, but neither is it devotional. It simply has self-awareness and then begins to have awareness of other. It begins to develop will. It begins to develop desire. Then at this point, it makes the mistake of choosing ahankara versus ahamparatyaya. That is, it chooses illusion rather than being with God and its own self-nature. When that Atman first falls into the material realm, necessarily it has to begin its sojourn in materiality at a very high level of being. A being doesn't go from pure spirituality to then being a cockroach, to then being a gnat, to then being a piece of grass. No, it has to start in a very high place with ego, very little, very subtle ego, but ego nonetheless. That is Brahma. Thus, and this is why there are also an infinite number of universes. Each being, when they initially fall into the material world, the first being they become is Brahma. So, spiritually speaking, a fall down is, materially speaking, that you become the highest being within the material realm. You see? Here being, let's say, the demarcation point, you don't go from here to here, you go from here to here. That's Brahma. And that's why also there must be an infinite number of universes, because there must be an infinite number of Brahmas, because an infinite number of beings are at any given quote-unquote time falling into materiality. Every living being, in other words, every unit of consciousness, every Atman that we see around us, every person in this room, every person in Omaha, every person on this planet, every person on every planet, every dog, every cat, every being of every species, all of them being Atman, ultimately consciousness. Each one of them at one point fell into the material world. When they did that, they were all a Brahma at first. Thus, all of us at one time were Brahma of some universe or another. I can tell you I was a Brahma. Everyone here was a Brahma at one time. And then from there, you fall further down into samsara, into the cycle of reincarnation, in accordance with karma, desire, etc. Does that make sense? There's a lot more that can be said about that. I tried to do this in as brief a nutshell as possible. But that's why. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I mean, if we had more time, I would like to hear more about why Natman would choose to fall down rather than going into more devotional state, but I don't know if we have time to talk about that.
Not a lot of time, but I can tell you the brief answer. Such is the nature of free will. Free will without the scope to exercise free will is not free will, it's automation. That simple. It's one thing to claim free will, but free will with the inability to act is not free will. It's only a concept. So, that being the case, if any being did not have the ability to choose not God versus God, then that would take away their free will. They would be automated beings in that case, rather than free beings. And thus they would not be reflective of their source, which is God, who is what? Swarat, the ultimate independent, the ultimate free being. Nutshell explanation. But we'll talk later. I can give you a deeper, infinitely deeper explanation. All right. Shall we stop there? Did you have another question? Maybe one more.
Did we know how far we would fall when we chose materiality?
No. We didn't know. We hoped for the best. And we dove, we plunged, hoping for the best. We didn't know. We followed the natural consequences of our free will decisions. That's what happened. And thus we find ourselves at present, wherever we are. People in this room being among the lucky ones, because A, we're in human form, B, we're in human form, not passed out drunk in a bar somewhere, but in a temple, an ashram, discovering who and what we truly are. Think of how lucky we are.
Is that to find our way back? Is that, I mean...
That's why we're here.
Great question of how far, do we know how far we fall? But, and that's the cycle of returning.
That's our goal. Our goal ultimately is to come to a point where A, we want to return, because of course most people embrace their illusion, but some people don't. Including, I would think, most if not all the people in this room. We want to know who and what we truly are, what is the actual nature of ourselves, of reality, etc. And thus, yes, come to that ultimate goal of all beings, which is to return to our source, to know God again, and to escape illusion and materiality. Yeah, that's the ultimate goal. That's why spiritual people do what they do. That's why they search. That's why they read. They try to look for wisdom. That's why they do practices that will help them to still the confusion, bewilderment within their own mind in such a way that they can have clearer insight. That's why we pray. That's why we have devotion toward God, etc., etc., etc.
So any of this knowledge that was imparted by Brahman, and then directly to the heart of Brahma, we're not able to some way tap into that, or do we all get pieces of that knowledge to kind of help project us towards, so we can get a taste back of divinity or whatever you would call it, or back to God knowing or something? That I don't know if I'm asking a question.
No, you are. No, it's a good question. Yes, the goal is for all of us as individuals to eventually come to the point where we have that full, pure knowledge again. And as far as having that knowledge, that is all dependent on us as individuals. We will have a greater or lesser degree of that knowledge in direct proportion to our sincerity and our search for that knowledge. That simple. In other words, anyone in this room, you want to fully know everything that is of true importance. You want to know your true self. You want to know what is the nature of reality. You want to know God. You can know that. You have to be very sincere, and you have to desire it more than anything. You have to desire it more than a cigarette. You have to desire it more than a drink. You have to desire it more than massaging your ego. You have to desire it more than, and on and on. You have that form of desire where it means more to you than anything, and you have sincerity. That knowledge, in the same way that God, and you see, gets back to the beginning of this verse. That knowledge, in the same way that God himself imparted the knowledge to the first being of this universe, that knowledge will be imparted onto us, but also by a living being. This is the Guru. This is why we approach the Guru. Because that knowledge is not something that we can just kind of read in books. It's there, but still, books are not enough. It is knowledge that has to be given to us by another living being who has that knowledge. But that's it. Sincerity and tremendous desire. More desire for that than anything else, and it's guaranteed we will have it. That sincerity and that desire itself will be our vehicle for knowing truth. And that truth imparted unto us by another person who knows the truth perfectly and fully. That's the Guru. True Guru, Sadguru. Like we talked about on Monday. Not at a bare minimum, 95% of individuals who call themselves gurus who are frauds. True Guru, Sadguru, individual who personifies truth. That's a good place to end.